The soft hum of hospital machines filled the quiet room, their rhythmic beeps a steady reminder of time slipping away. The fluorescent lights above cast a pale glow over the frail figure lying motionless on the bed. John Mitchell, a decorated war veteran, was breathing heavily, each breath feeling like a battle against the inevitable. Beside him, his son Mark sat with his hands folded, watching his father's chest rise and fall. The silence between them was heavy, filled with emotions neither of them could fully express. John's hands, thin and veined, clutched an old, worn photograph, a black and white picture of his younger self in uniform, standing proudly with his unit. His fellow soldiers, frozen in time, stared back at him, a reminder of the men he had fought beside, the friends he had lost, and the battles he had endured. His grandchildren, too young to fully grasp the weight of the moment, whispered quietly in the corner of the room, their innocent giggles a sharp contrast to the sorrow hanging in the air. John's daughter-in-law, Susan, wiped a tear from her cheek, pretending she wasn't watching her father-in-law slip away. The doctor had said he had only hours left. Maybe less. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, John broke the silence. "Mark." His voice trembled, weak yet determined. His son leaned in immediately, gripping his father's frail hand. "I'm here, Dad. What do you need?" John's lips parted, and for a moment it seemed like he had lost the strength to speak. Then, with great effort, he uttered the words that sent a chill down Mark's spine. "I need to speak with the President, before I go." The room fell into a stunned silence. Mark blinked, his grip tightening around his father's hand. "What? Dad, that's not—" John inhaled slowly, gathering his strength. "Son, I don't have much time. I need to hear it from him." "Hear what?" Mark whispered, his heart pounding. John swallowed hard, his voice raw with emotion. "That what I fought for wasn't in vain." Susan gasped softly, pressing a hand to her mouth. The weight of his words settled on everyone in the room. Mark's throat tightened. "Dad, he's the President of the United States. You really think he'll take a call from us?" John's eyes, glassy but unwavering, locked onto his son's. "He will." Mark looked at his father, at the photograph clutched in his shaking hands, and at the hope flickering in his fading gaze. This wasn't just a request. This was his dying wish. And Mark knew, no matter how impossible it seemed, he had to try. If you had one last conversation left in your life, who would you choose to speak to? And why? Mark stared at his father, his mind racing. How was he supposed to do this? Calling the most powerful man in the country wasn't exactly something you could do on a whim. But John's eyes held a quiet certainty. He truly believed Trump would answer. Mark sighed and pulled out his phone. He had no idea where to start, but he knew one thing. His father's time was running out. The first call, a dismissal. Mark dialed the hospital administrator's office first. "Hello, this is Mark Mitchell. My father, a veteran, is in your ICU. He's dying, and he has one last wish, to speak with President Trump." A long pause. Then the woman on the other end of the line sighed. "Sir, I'm very sorry about your father, but the president is a busy man. These kinds of requests don't exactly go through." Mark clenched his jaw. "I understand, but this isn't just any man. He fought for this country. He gave his life for it. He just wants to hear that it wasn't for nothing." Silence. A softer voice now. "I'll see what I can do." Click. Mark exhaled, his heart pounding. It was a long shot. Maybe nothing would come of it, but he wasn't going to stop there. A veteran's last plea. John stirred in his hospital bed, his breathing heavier now. Mark rushed to his side. "Did you get through?" John rasped. Mark hesitated. "Not yet, but I'm not giving up." John's hand tightened around his old war photo. His voice was barely above a whisper. "We don't leave our own behind, son." Mark swallowed hard. He could see it in his father's face. He needed this. The request goes higher. Mark called a local congressman's office. He explained the situation, his voice shaking with urgency. The staffer on the other end listened carefully. A dying veteran? And he only wants to hear from President Trump? Yes, Mark said. I don't care what it takes. I don't care how unlikely it is. He needs to know that someone still cares. The staffer hesitated. Then, in a voice that sounded almost hesitant, almost afraid to promise anything, he said, I'll pass it on. Mark ran a shaking hand through his hair. He had done all he could. Now it was up to fate. Hours pass. Time is running out. John's breathing worsened. Nurses checked his vitals. Mark could see the concern in their eyes. Susan stood by the door, biting her lip, fighting back tears. It's not happening, is it? She whispered. Mark wanted to argue. He wanted to believe. But maybe she was right. Maybe. This request had never stood a chance. He took his father's hand in his own, whispering, I tried, Dad. I really did. John blinked slowly, his voice weak. That's okay, son. The phone rang. The call that changed everything. A nurse burst into the room, her face pale. Mark, she gasped, you need to pick up the phone, now. Mark's heart nearly stopped. His hands were shaking as he reached for the receiver. A voice on the other end, firm, professional. Please hold for President Donald J. Trump. Silence. Mark's breath caught in his throat. Then a voice he never expected to hear came through the line. This is President Trump. Is John still with us? Have you ever been told something was impossible, only to see it happen right in front of your eyes? For a brief moment, time stood still. The hospital room, filled with the steady beeping of machines and the quiet shuffling of nurses, now held its breath. The air was thick with disbelief as everyone's eyes locked onto the phone in Mark's trembling hands. The voice on the other end of the line was unmistakable. This is President Trump. Is John still with us? Mark nearly dropped the phone. His breath caught in his throat as he turned toward his father. John was barely conscious now, his chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. His grip on the old photograph of his war buddies had loosened slightly. His once strong hands, hands that had carried weapons in battle, hands that had built a life for his family, were now weak and fragile. Mark forced himself to speak. Yes, Mr. President, he's still here. A pause on the other end. Then Trump's voice, calm, steady, but softer than usual. Put him on. I want to talk to him. Mark hesitated. His father was fading fast. Could he even hold the phone? A nurse stepped forward quickly, gently adjusting John's hospital bed so he was sitting up slightly. Another nurse dabbed his forehead with a cool cloth. Mark held the receiver close to his father's ear, his hands shaking. Dad, he whispered, the president is on the line. The moment that no one expected. John's eyes fluttered. A flicker of something, awareness, strength, returned for the first time in hours. His fingers twitched slightly, reaching. Mark helped guide the phone to his father's ear. A pause. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, John spoke. Mr. President, His voice broke, the simple act of speaking now an exhausting effort, but he refused to stop. I just wanted to say thank you. The words were soft, strained, but filled with something deeper than gratitude. A final salute from a soldier to his commander-in-chief. Trump's unexpected silence. The room was so quiet that even the machines seemed to hush. On the other end of the line, Donald Trump didn't speak right away. For a man known for his quick responses and commanding presence, this pause was unusual. Mark held his breath. Was Trump at a loss for words? Then finally, the president spoke. No, John, it's me who should be thanking you. His voice was lower now, no longer the voice of a politician, but of a man speaking to another man, one who had given everything for his country. A promise that couldn't be broken. Trump continued, his tone more personal than Mark had ever heard. You served your country, John. You put your life on the line, and I want you to know, you were never forgotten. John's lips trembled slightly. His fingers tightened weakly around the phone. I just needed to know, he whispered. Trump's voice hardened, not with anger, but with resolve. John, I promise you this. As long as I'm here, our veterans will never be forgotten. Your sacrifice meant something. Your service mattered, and your country will always honor you. A single tear slid down John's cheek. His breathing was slow, uneven. For a soldier who had spent his life standing strong, carrying the weight of war and sacrifice, this moment was something else entirely. This was the peace he had been searching for. The room holds its breath. Mark, Susan, the nurses, everyone in the room watched, their own eyes brimming with tears. Mark tried to swallow the lump in his throat. His father had been a man of few words. He had never asked for much. But this was the one thing he needed before he left this world. Trump's voice came through the speaker once more, softer this time. John, if there's anything else you need, anything at all, you just tell me. A long silence. John's lips parted. He took in a slow, trembling breath, his chest barely rising. Then, with every last ounce of strength he had left, he spoke. Mr. President, promise me, you'll always stand by the soldiers. Mark's eyes filled with tears. John wasn't thinking about himself, not even in his final moments. Even now, he was thinking about every soldier who had ever fought, every brother in arms he had lost. Trump's final words. Trump's response came without hesitation. John, you have my word. John's lips curled into the faintest smile. His hand, now weak and trembling, slowly released its grip on the photograph. The picture of his younger self, standing proud in his uniform, drifted gently onto his hospital blanket. For the first time in a long time, he looked at peace. Mark felt his breath hitch. The monitors beeped slower. His father's grip on the phone loosened. John exhaled, a soft, steady breath. Then, the line went silent. If you only had moments left, what promise would bring you peace? The hospital room was silent. The air felt heavy, as if even the walls understood what had just happened. Mark's fingers remained on the phone, though the line had gone quiet. His father's hand had fallen still, his breath no longer rising and falling. Susan pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. A nurse slowly reached over and placed her fingers on John's wrist. A moment later, she gave a small, solemn nod. He's gone. The words felt unreal, even as Mark's heart shattered. His father, the strongest man he had ever known, had just taken his last breath. But he had gotten his wish. He had heard the words he needed before he left this world. And he had left in peace. Trump remains on the line. The phone was still in Mark's hands. The line hadn't disconnected. Mark realized in that moment that President Trump was still there, listening, waiting. A deep, slow breath came from the other end. Then, in a tone completely different from anything Mark had ever heard from him before, Trump spoke. Mark, I'm sorry for your loss. The voice was quiet, stripped of politics, of speeches, of public persona. This wasn't the president speaking to a citizen. This was a man speaking to a son who had just lost his father. Mark swallowed hard, his grip on the phone tightening. His voice came out hoarse, broken. He held on just for that moment. A pause. Then Trump responded. Then I'm honored to have been part of it. Mark felt his chest tighten. His father had fought in wars that most people had forgotten. He had seen things no one should ever have to see. But in his final moments, he had been heard. He had been acknowledged. He had been respected. Trump took a breath. He was a hero, and I won't forget him." A lump formed in Mark's throat. He had nothing left to say. So he simply whispered, "Thank you, Mr. President." The line clicked, and the call ended. The story spreads. Mark never intended for his father's story to become a national headline. But the nurses had been listening, and so had one particular hospital staff member, a woman who had lost her own father, a veteran, years before. She had been the one to pass the story along, and before long, it was everywhere: news channels, veteran organizations, social media. Dying veteran's final wish granted, President Trump calls moments before his passing. The story spread like wildfire, and the response? Something no one had expected. Veterans across America react. At first, it was just a few letters, then hundreds. Veterans, old and young, began writing to Mark. Some sent photos of their own fathers who had served. Others shared stories of how their loved ones had never been given a final moment like John's. And then, the White House called. The president wanted to do something more. Trump's tribute. A few days later, Mark received a package. The return address? The White House. Inside, folded neatly, was an American flag. A letter sat on top of it. It was signed personally by Donald J. Trump. Mark unfolded the paper, his hands shaking. The words were simple. John Mitchell served his country with honor, and his country will never forget him. Donald J. Trump. Mark swallowed the lump in his throat. His father had always told him one thing: "We don't leave our own behind." And now, neither had his country. The funeral that touched the nation. John's funeral was small, just family and a few close friends. But at the very end, when the honor guard folded the flag and placed it into Mark's hands, something happened. A group of veterans, men and women John had never even met, stood at the back of the cemetery. They raised their hands in salute. Some were in wheelchairs. Some had tears streaming down their faces. And as the final salute was given, one veteran, his uniform covered in medals, whispered loud enough for Mark to hear, "Rest easy, soldier. You were heard." What does it mean to truly be remembered? The cemetery stood in somber silence. A cold breeze rustled the American flag, draped over John Mitchell's coffin. The honor guard stood at attention, their movements crisp and deliberate. A 21-gun salute echoed across the open field. Mark sat in the front row, his hands clasped tightly together. On one side, Susan dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. On the other, his father's closest friends, men who had served beside him in war, now aged and frail but standing tall, watched the ceremony unfold, their faces unreadable. Then came the moment. The folded American flag was carefully presented to Mark, the weight of it feeling heavier than he ever expected. "On behalf of a grateful nation," the soldier recited, his voice steady. Mark swallowed hard as he accepted it. His father's final moment, his final wish, had reached far beyond this small service. It had touched the country. The White House acknowledgement. 2 days after the funeral, the White House press secretary took to the podium. The room was full of journalists, cameras flashing. Most were expecting the usual topics: policies, decisions, debates. Instead, the press secretary paused for a long moment before speaking. "Before we begin, President Trump wanted me to share something with you all today." She cleared her throat, unfolding a piece of paper. "Last week, a great American passed away. John Mitchell was not a famous man. He was not a politician. He was not someone who sought recognition, but he was, above all, a soldier, a man who gave his life for his country and asked for nothing in return." The room fell silent. Some of these journalists, hardened by years of political battles, lowered their pens. Before he passed, he had one last wish: to know that his service meant something. President Trump honored that wish by calling him personally, and today, we honor him again. She paused, looking out into the crowd. John Mitchell's name will not be forgotten, and neither will the sacrifices of every veteran who has given their life for this country. A beat, then soft claps. Not political, not forced, just respect. The words that would last forever. That night, Mark sat on his porch, watching the flag his father had left behind flutter in the breeze. It still didn't feel real. His father was gone. But his story. His father's voice had been heard by the most powerful man in the country. His legacy would live on. As he sat there, the phone on the table buzzed. A message from an unknown number. He hesitated. Then he opened it. It was a simple message. Just 2 words. We remember. Mark closed his eyes. That was all he needed to hear. What will your legacy be? Will your voice be remembered? A few weeks later, Mark sat down to write. He had never been one for public speaking, never thought he would share something so personal. But his father had believed in something bigger than himself. And Mark wanted the world to know. He started with a simple post. My father was not a famous man. He didn't make headlines. But before he left this world, the President of the United States called him and made him a promise that his service would never be forgotten. That promise didn't just belong to my father. It belongs to every soldier who has ever served. Every man and woman who has worn the uniform. If you are reading this, take a moment to thank a veteran. Tell them they are seen. Tell them they are heard. Because they deserve that much. The post went viral. Thousands of comments poured in. People shared their own stories. Sons and daughters of veterans. Wives and husbands who had lost their loved ones. And among the sea of words, one comment stood out the most. From the official account of Donald J. Trump himself. It was simple. America will never forget. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who believes in the power of honor, sacrifice, and gratitude. Let's make sure that no hero is ever forgotten. Because their service deserves to be remembered. Always. United States.